How's it going, everybody? I'm Danilo Evangelista for the Hurricane Hub off-season discussion for Saturday, December 10th, 2022. Let's get right on with it, shall we? First, of course, taking a look at the National Hurricane Center homepage with nothing going on, of course, since it's the off-season. Nothing really happens in the off season except for a few times, and as we saw this earlier this week, there was something in the Atlantic. Invest 99L ended up not becoming anything, and I was too sick to cover it, but it didn't become much in the end, so I guess it was good enough for me not to really cover and be on top of, since it really wasn't anything in the end anyways. But still, that does prove the point that stuff could still happen in the off season. There still could be attempts for development as long as the conditions are there. Things could still try to get going, and as we saw, they did at least try this past week, and especially looking back at all the May storms we've had in recent years, it really does prove that the dates of the hurricane season aren't absolute, and things can still happen before or after the hurricane season. But now with that done, and we have 99L over with, we're back to off-season mode. And with that, let's take a look at what we have for the sea surface temperature anomalies as of yesterday, December 9th, 2022. Of course, NOAA Coral Reef Watch always a day behind, but that's just how they update. Taking a look at what we have in the Atlantic. Warm, of course, it's the same situation. We have warm in the eastern Atlantic off the Canaries, and then off the east coast, and especially in the Gulf of Mexico, which has been remaining warm for quite a while now. This will be interesting, of course, not only for hurricane season next year if this persists, which it could, but also severe weather in winter season whenever we have these huge like low pressure systems, these huge mid U.S. storms that develop sometimes and then move eastward, or we have low pressures that develop in the Gulf, and they become those Miller A or Miller B type storms that move from the Gulf of Mexico and across the East Coast and become huge nor'easters for the Northeast, or sometimes the Mid-Atlantic as well, and sometimes even the Carolinas too. They all develop from the Gulf, and with the Gulf being this warm, this could be really interesting to see how we have these systems take that energy from the Gulf and potentially strengthen and become quite formidable winter systems. So we'll have to watch it as well, including severe weather season, and of course out in the Pacific, our La Nina remains the case there. It has been for the past several years, and it will remain at least for the time being. The rest of the Pacific, the northern Pacific, very warm. And of course, also associated with the La Nina in a way has to do with the ocean currents we have off the southwest coast of the United States and off the Mexican coastline, roughly around near to mostly slightly below normal water temperatures present at this point in time. Looking at the Nino 3.4 index, as we do see a latest value roughly at 1.1 below normal. If we look at the map, the usual area that we look for the threshold of La Nina is 0.5 degrees Celsius below normal. And if we notice, look, that we've been basically at below normal and basically at or below the La Nina threshold for quite a bit of time now, which is a symptom of this La Nina that has been continuing for quite a while. It's been basically constant at its place right near 1.1 degrees Celsius below normal, and that just shows how persistent this La Nina has been. And if we take a look at the SOI dashboard, if we give it a minute for the website to launch, here it is. Looking at the SOI dashboard in the positive territory for the last 30 and 90 days too. The 90 days has been consistent, and that's also a little bit more important because 90 days is over an average of 3 months, and if it's been consistent over average of 3 months, it shows that the pattern has been persistent, and it looks like that it might stay with us for a little longer, as for how persistent it has been. As for the 30-day average, we do notice that we have dropped off a little bit with the 30-day average. over the past 10 or so days, over the past 2 weeks, has rebounded since, but still positive territory. And with that being said, while that remains in positive territory, La Nina will remain with us for the time being. Taking a look at the CDAS, sea surface temperature anomalies, and look at what we have across the Atlantic. Just taking a look at what's out there, the Gulf of Mexico. Well, you can see why it's very warm because we have this part of the Caribbean, and I'm guessing this is most likely the loop current that is poking out like this. That's coming from the Caribbean. The Caribbean, this current that comes in from the Caribbean kind of pokes into the Gulf of Mexico, then goes into the Florida Straits and follows the Gulf Stream. The loop current, as we call it in the Gulf of Mexico, and this is also a term that we use throughout the hurricane season sometimes because they could really help bring heat and energy from the Caribbean into the Gulf of Mexico, and sometimes help with the strengthening of storms. And it is attached to the Gulf Stream. That part of the loop current has remained very warm. We still have 26, 27s, and even some 28s in the Gulf of Mexico. As you go further south, of course, because the northern Gulf of Mexico, as with the Arctic air coming in from the northern United States more frequently since it's getting closer to winter, the northern portion of the Gulf of Mexico has begun to mix and cool as we would expect. But the Gulf of Mexico on the central and southern part still remains quite warm, 26s, and still widespread 27 degrees markings, still pretty widespread throughout most of the central and southern Gulf of Mexico, and of course the Caribbean, since it's much closer to the equator. That part is still very solidly in the 27s and 28s, even 29s in some areas. And even take a look at the Gulf Stream here off the East Coast, off Florida. That's still very warm, around 26 and probably 27 degrees Celsius in there. And you could also see 27 degrees Celsius off the East Coast, roughly around the Carolinas, along the Gulf Stream as well, and even extending up to the northern parts of the Gulf Stream, right near the North Carolina coast. We're still at 26 degrees Celsius too, and even 25, all the way up to the outer banks of the Carolinas. So still very warm waters there. And of course, they will mix and cool as winter comes, and we have more Arctic air that comes from the northern United States to come in and mix all of this up. But as for right now, still very warm waters. Still things are going to cool down though for the future. Taking a look at the wind shear across the Atlantic, and this is something that we do look at throughout hurricane season, especially as we get towards the peak season. But just want to give you an idea of what we're going to use. Some of the things we're going to use, we're going to show you here today. That includes wind shear, and obviously this is why we don't typically look for December to produce much of anything, because this is what we usually have. Wind shear very high throughout the entire Atlantic. Consistent values here: 40 knots, 50 knots, 60 knots, 70 knots of wind shear. And if you're a new person to the hurricane tracking community, you want to know what wind shear is. It's basically, imagine a cross section from the surface to the atmosphere of a lower level of the atmosphere, a mid level of the atmosphere, and an upper level of the atmosphere. And wind shear is the change in direction of the winds from each of the low level and the mid level and the upper level parts of the atmosphere. Higher wind shear is higher differences of winds blowing in different directions and also different speeds at different points of the atmosphere. So that's what we have a lot of here, and hurricanes do tend to look at lower amounts of wind shear because they need healthy thunderstorms to develop upwards, as thunderstorms do with convection. They develop upward and gain their energy that way. And wind shear, when we have that, that does not favor that because that blows thunderstorms sideways and away from vertical, which does not allow hurricanes to develop. And until we get greens here, which we won't get till probably May or June, because that's when we look towards developments more, not in December, because that's more as obvious as the off season. We won't get any development, and that's especially noted at this time of the year. We do have some 10s and some 15s and some more favorable wind shear values, but those are all the way in the mid latitudes, not in the deep tropics where we would typically monitor development, so that is not really of any concern. And another map that we do look at is the vorticity, because that shows any area, basically any area of clumped spin in the atmosphere, which is also a sign of where energy might be getting going and coming together to try to become a system or become of some sort of area of interest to watch for potential hurricane development. And we don't really see much of clumped vorticity in the deep tropics. So we have a bunch of this in the mid latitudes, which is typical for this time of year, as we see a lot more mid latitude anticyclone extratropical, not anticyclone, but extratropical activity, or non-tropical lows becoming big winter storms out in the mid-latitudes of the Atlantic, or sometimes off the east coast, or sometimes near Greenland. That's what these are in the mid-latitudes. And if we look at the deep tropics, there isn't really much going on, and that is expected since it's December. But as we go towards the months and as we go towards April and May, we will start to see this fill up a little bit more as we have pieces of energy coming off Africa that begins to fill up and light up the deep tropics. But we'll only see that really as we move towards April and May, when we start to see that happen a little bit more. Alright, since there's nothing to talk about besides that when it comes to tropical weather, I do want to mention this because this is really important, that we will see, and has been a lot of talk about, especially when it comes to severe weather, of a big storm system that's been developing in the middle portion of the United States. And you can already see that winter storm watches have been put into effect for, I think, the Dakotas, North and South Dakota, and I think some parts of Montana too. And this will also be associated, this general winter system will be associated with some severe weather too that is expected to take place in the southeast and the south central United States, right around the Gulf states, Louisiana being one of them. And I do want to show you here on the GFS, it really does start from this huge low pressure that develops in the central United States, and you can see what happens here, why we have those winter storm warnings. A bunch of blues begin to show up, and with that, this huge line, this huge cold front that develops with it, and that will bring severe weather to the southern portions of the United States. Huge winter storms, it seems, for the northern lakes. I think I could go here to precipitation, and it might show us how much snowfall we could see in some of those places. Let's take a little bit for it to load. You can see some of those places show upwards of 12, 15, 20 inches of snow, and sometimes even up to 2 feet, depending on where you are. And then if we take a look at the Storm Prediction Center site for the severe weather part of it, and it just passed, this is now the day 8, but this is day 4, and day 5, you see that there are multiple chances for severe weather too. We have both days, we have a 15% and a 30% chance for portions of Louisiana, and then day 5 there's a 15% chance for the Gulf Coast, roughly surrounding Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama. And that is associated, if we go back to this map here, with this huge line of severe weather that develops ahead of this huge low pressure that develops in the northern midsection of the United States, and that brings heavy snow to the northern United States, while we do see that line continue eastward, and that brings severe weather to portions of the southeastern United States. So all part of this big associated pattern that is a big winter storm that will take shape in the mid United States. What am I thinking? But other than that, nothing really much going on. If you're going to experience this weather, if you're about to experience severe weather, of course you can prepare for that, and as well winter weather if you're in one of these areas that are in the northern United States that is about to expect some of the snow. Of course, you can prepare for that as well. But other than that, nothing much else going on in terms of weather and tropical weather, of course. Nothing much else to talk about in this discussion for today. So I guess we'll wrap it up here. If you did, of course, like what you saw, would really appreciate it if you go ahead, like and subscribe too, and also share with family and friends. Let's get a community going. And that's it. That's it. Really, have a great rest of your weekend. Stay safe, everybody, especially in these times that we're dealing with right now. And we'll talk again later. See ya.